In this lesson, we will be setting up our Pinia store so that we can get the course progress in the Pinia store instead of in our local storage. We'll also later on in this chapter move the course progress into the database so that we can actually keep track of it in a good way as opposed to just relying on local storage. Now, the course progress state is fairly simple, so if this is all your application was doing, you could keep it in just some well-written composables. But we will be using Pinia in order to showcase how Pinia would work with Nuxt. And one of the benefits of using Pinia is that you get a really good integration with the dev tools, and so you can see that working. So the first step is to install Pinia, and Pinia comes with a Nuxt module as well. So we'll install all of that together. The next step is to register the Pinia module in our Nuxt config. There we go. And we will be adding a store in the stores folder. So we'll just create that for ourselves first. Then we'll create a full file called courseprogress.ts. And our course progress Pinia store will first look like this. So in Pinia, there are two different ways of defining stores. The first is the options store, which looks a lot like the options API and is very similar to the Vuex API. The other syntax is the setup store, which reflects the composition API. It's very similar to and almost exactly the same as just writing your composables in a setup function on your component. So it feels like you're just writing a component that has no rendering. And so I prefer this because it keeps that consistency between your Vue components and the Pinia store because they are written in exactly the same way. So what we're doing here is first we have to pass in a key to describe this store, similar to how we provide a key to use state. And then we have this progress, which we're going to initialize from our local storage. Then we're going to have a ref to keep track of whether or not we've initialized this store. And then we have this initialize function. What we're going to do is first check to see if the store has been initialized. And if it has, we're going to exit early. But if not, we're going to continue on. And so the reason that we have this initialize function is that we cannot have our setup here be async. Yet, we need to use data that is async. We need to get data from our endpoints later on that will be async. And so we have to put that in a method that's async. And so to get around that is we just put it inside of an action. And then when we call this action, it will load up the data that we need to initialize the store. But for right now, this method doesn't really do anything. And all that we're doing is moving the progress from the lesson component and into this store. We also need a way to toggle the progress of our lesson. This toggle complete method is a stub method, which we will expand on once we get our endpoints going. But for now, all it does is it takes in the chapter and lesson slug. If there's no user, there's no progress that we can update on the backend, so we return early. And then what we do is we first grab the current progress, and then we set that progress to be the opposite. So in this way, we're able to toggle the value. But right now, we're only doing this in the client and not updating anything in the backend. That will come later on in this chapter. once we've added in this action, we need to then export it so we can use it elsewhere. And one thing that we're doing here is we're optimistically updating the UI. So this is a common pattern, especially if you have a slow backend. This is commonly done on mobile devices, which are usually subject to slower cellular networks. But what we do is, instead of waiting for the backend to tell us that what we've done is successful, we just first assume that it will work. And if it doesn't work, then we backtrack, because 99% of the time it will work successfully. So we should just assume that it always will. And then in those 1% or less of cases where we actually weren't able to update the progress, then we'll just backtrack. So this makes our UI much snappier and faster than if we were just always waiting for that slow network request. So I wanted to throw that in there just so you can see this pattern here. Another thing that I like to do is to provide really good defaults to different methods and composables that we're using. And so in our case, we always have to pass in the chapter and the lesson, but it's a pretty good assumption that we just want to default to whatever we're on currently, whichever lesson, whichever chapter we're currently looking at. So we'll add this code in here to automatically default to that. If one of these is missing, we will grab the corresponding one from the route so that we can fall back on the current lesson that we are using. So now we've got a pretty good store going. We're grabbing the progress from local storage. And then we've got this toggle complete button that lets us toggle the progress. So far, what we're doing is just refactoring the functionality that we already have and moving it into this Pinia store. So now we need to go and actually use this store. So we'll go to our lesson slug component here. We'll need to import from our store. Then we'll need to initialize that store by calling use course progress. And then because all that we're using here right now is these methods, we can destructure off of this store. With Pinia, we have to be careful that we're not destructuring the refs off of this object, because if we do that, we will lose reactivity. We'll also initialize the store by calling initialize here. And we only need to initialize this in one component. But because we've added in that check, it doesn't matter if we call this initialize in multiple components by accident, because we have that safeguard. The other thing that I'm going to add is an isCompleted computed prop. And this one will look at the store progress and see if our current lesson is completed or not. And that's what we will be using in the lesson. So now we need to update the template to reflect these changes. And our model value is now is completed. And our function here, toggle complete, is the same. But we also need to remove all of that existing stuff so we can get rid of everything here. You may have noticed that prior we were using an array to keep track of our progress. But in this store here, we've switched to an object, and we've switched to using the actual slugs for the chapter and the lesson and not the number for the lesson, not the index. I've refactored this data structure in this way because it's a lot easier to keep track of things with their slugs, especially once we start adding in the database. We will want to fetch things based on a unique value, which is the slug and not the index. And this is a bit more of a descriptive data structure as well, as opposed to just having nested array of numbers. And one thing that I forgot to add here is we can't update unless we have a user logged in. Because we're using the database, we need to associate all of our course progress with a specific user. And that means requiring a user to be logged in. So we need to put a VIF here to first check if we have a user logged in. And if not, we just don't show the lesson completion button. So in this lesson, we have begun to lay the groundwork to refactor our app from keeping course progress in local storage to storing it in the database and then using Pinia as a client-side store. In the next lesson, we're going to take a slight detour and actually fix a small regression that I introduced in the previous chapter on the meta endpoint. But then we will resume with putting together our Pinia store with the database.